So out of the almost 200 samurai movies that I've talked about on this channel, still somehow I haven't covered the much praised Samurai Trilogy. This is the 1954 to 1956 films based on the novel Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. And Musashi is one of the best novels I've ever read. In fact, I love it so much I pretty much listen to its audio every year, and I especially like to do so while gardening. Sort of like my form of meditation every year. I don't know, it just goes so well with being outside in nature. And it's a fictionalized telling of the real-life Miyamoto Musashi. What it does is it takes some truths about him, but it also adds other fictional things to make the story more interesting. And I think that's because we don't have a full documented history of his entire life, so he sort of just filled in the blanks. And the story's so good because it's just filled with all these Eastern life lessons about strength and knowledge and improving yourself. There's also an excellent manga, Vagabonds, and I just love reading that one outside every year as well. So there is a few adaptations of this story, so you have quite a few to choose from. And later on in this video I'll let you know which adaptation is the best one. But I have to be honest with this film trilogy. The first time I watched it I was kind of bored. And that's really because I didn't know the backstory of it yet, and I really didn't even know that much about Miyamoto Musashi, you know, besides his famous duel with Sasaki Kojirō. But after reading the novel and reading the manga Vagabonds, I found these films a hell of a lot more interesting. And it was really interesting to see what scenes they'd bring to life from the novel. And the film also stars Toshiro Mifune, one of my favorite actors of all time, and I thought he was the perfect choice playing the legendary Musashi. And in the beginning of the film, he really just nails that wildness that that character had when he was young. And he's also great too when the character's much more older and wiser. You know, Mifune could play really any role. He's just such a great actor. And you know that because when you watch this, you no longer see the actor Mifune. You begin to see the legendary sword saint himself, Miyamoto Musashi. So the trilogy is made up of 3 films. First one is Miyamoto Musashi, 1954. And then the second film is the duel at Ichijoji Temple, 1955. And then the final film is the duel at Ganryu Island, 1956. And the release of these films really marks an important moment in the development of the samurai film, and just its role as not only the predominant genre of Japan, but also Japan's most exported film type in world cinema. And one aspect to note about when the first film in this trilogy came out, it's the same year as Seventh Samurai. And many will tell you that Seventh Samurai marked the beginning of the samurai genre. But I believe there's more to the story. While Seventh Samurai is easily the best film in my opinion, and just deserves a ton of well-deserved credit, its fame unfortunately takes away from the significance of the first film in the Samurai Trilogy. After all, it was the first film in this trilogy, and not Seventh Samurai, that would take home the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film in 1955. Later, this first film in the trilogy would be known as Samurai 1 Musashi Miyamoto, since the other 2 films would follow it. And it's really this trilogy that would contribute to the marriage of the Western and the samurai film, also known as Chambara. While Seventh Samurai would give birth to a brand new subgenre in which a team is assembled to complete a mission. This is a motive that inspired such stories as the Magnificent Seven and Star Wars. But Samurai 1 would help to revive a different aspect of mythology in cinema. In essence, the Samurai Trilogy is basically a Japanese version of Homer's The Iliad and Odyssey. And we'll get back to that reason why, but mainly it's because we see this young man go on adventures, and he develops into someone that's so much greater by the end of it. So, as for the story of the Samurai Trilogy, it follows the exploits, adventures, growth, and development of a young man in the shogunate period Japan by the name of Takezo. Takezo and his friend Madahachi are soldiers in the famous Battle of Sekigahara, and they flee when they find out that they're on the losing side. They seek shelter as fugitives with two young women, and this ends up leading to some misunderstandings, love triangles, escapes, and betrayals. Ultimately, the character of Takezo winds up in the custody of a Buddhist priest named Tokuan, and he ends up keeping Takezo detained for 3 years in a cell that's filled with books. And this really ends up being his saving grace, his chance at a new life. Because all throughout the first film, we see how skilled of a fighter Takezo is, but it's not his fighting, but rather his enlightenment that makes him the man that he is. And after just his immersion in the scripts of the priest's library, Takezo is eventually released from custody, and he's granted the name Miyamoto Musashi. And just from this point on, he becomes a national hero, whose influences, while real, became the stuff of legend. And we just follow him as he completes a series of duels in the following 2 movies, eventually leading up to his greatest challenge, the duel against Sasaki Kojirō. And this last duel ends up being his greatest challenge that he could ever face. And like I said, this duel is so famous in real life that I actually knew about it before I knew about Musashi himself. And again, it's the stuff of legend. And I will say, the final film in this does give us the best depiction of that fight, and just one of the best duels in cinema history. But throughout this story, I just really love how Musashi appeals first to his own personal enlightenment, and then to his skills with the sword. As he grows older, he becomes greater and wiser. He is never actually a samurai, as he is never the employee of a given lord. So he's actually technically a Ronin, a masterless samurai, a loner. Again, it is very similar to a cowboy. And actually, according to many historians, it's believed that Musashi was one of the 160 warriors who took part in the Battle of Sekigahara. And this was an incredibly important conflict for shogunate Japan, as it was part of a series of conflicts that would lead to the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. And it was also symbolically a symbol of the sacrifice needed for peace, as it is well established that the battle, once finished, ushered in a period of peace in Japan. And I will say, I was surprised to see that the first film in this trilogy does give us a really good depiction of this battle. And I was just surprised just how epic in scale it was. And I did mention this in a previous video, but if you're a fan of the show Shogun, this trilogy can actually work as an unofficial sequel to it, as it takes place historically right after that series. And earlier I mentioned how the Samurai Trilogy is a retelling to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that's because first we're introduced to the hero of the story, we get a war, and there's also cultural mythology. And after the conclusion of the war, we follow the hero. In the case of the Odyssey, it's Odysseus. And he first shelters with a strange woman. He maintains his virtue, he lives in imprisonment, combats evil, and completes a series of mythological tasks. This is before his ultimate test to win back his wife. His story not only tells of the war that established a national identity, but also as the individual of his character as is born of that national identity. But getting back to the Samurai Trilogy, the look of these films at the time especially is just stunning. Especially just the fact that it was the early days of color, most films are still in black and white, and the version I watched of this was the Criterion Blu-ray box set, and that's the easiest version to get a hold of. Overall, it's a good transfer for how old the film is, but it definitely could use some work. You could still see some actual wear and tear in the picture itself at the bottom. So definitely gives you a vintage look at least. And really, there's some subtle deepness to these films. And not only in its story, but also just in the images themselves. You'll find that oftentimes the images and the story points coalesce. For example, if we look at the character of Otsu, she's one of the first women that Musashi meets. She's a supporting character that seems to move with Musashi at every key point in his development. If we compare her to Western films, she's like the virtuous woman whose love acts as the keystone to the character's arc. And if we watch how she's portrayed in the first film, we first see her in this dirty shack, and later we find her by the clean waters. Not only is she a symbol, but also the images wherewith she is portrayed are also symbols. And this is one of the beauties of just a great film. With the character of Musashi, Mifune really provides his most diverse and dynamic acting performance ever. First, he plays the young and wild fighter who abandons his roots and sacrifices his patriotism. He then plays a frustrated prisoner who seeks out truth only after being forced. He then plays an enlightened warrior who travels through Japan in search of self-actualization. He then plays a wise sage who isn't just famous for his swordsmanship, but also for his art and knowledge. And through it all, he also plays a man in love, who is loved, and who finally, at the very end, chooses love. And finally, we get to what is the best way to experience this story. So first, just comparing the film to the novel that it was adapted from, I believe it would have worked a lot better as a series of 6 films instead of just 3. And that's because there's just so much to the story. There's just so many aspects and character developments, storylines, all stuff that was just left out from the novel that I would have loved to have seen. Characters like Madahachi or even his crazy mom were pretty much left out, where in the novel they were a key point of that entire story, pretty much. Same with Vagabond. I really like what they do with the character of Madahachi in that. Also, just characters like Taquan, I really wish we got more of him. His character in the novel and even the manga are just brilliant. I love how he's sort of like that, sort of wise-ass old man. He's sort of like the teacher that you need if you really want to change yourself. And there's just more fights and Musashi's character development that you really could only achieve if you had more movies or just a longer series. With the manga version, this is Takehiko Inoue's Vagabonds, many consider this to be the greatest manga of all time. And it's also one of the most beautiful and best drawn mangas I've ever seen. I really don't know if anything tops it. and each page is just a work of art. It's such a nice read. So just for the art itself, I highly recommend it. And it is a little different from the novel. Some aspects go in a more interesting way and different way. However, the one major problem that prevents this from being the best adaptation is the fact that it was never finished. It's been on an indefinite hiatus since May of 2015. And I think a big reason for that is just because the art is just so ambitious that it ended up being too much for him to finish. So obviously the best adaptation is still the original source. This oftentimes is the case. Really only a handful of films can actually outperform the novel or source material itself, just because, you know, the novel is always going to have more to it. More character development, more storylines, more memorable moments. And Musashi really is just one of the greatest novels and even stories of all time. And I definitely recommend reading it or just checking out the audiobook. I always prefer the audiobooks. But I do warn you, it is very long. But there's no rush, you know, you could treat it as a life journey. Slowly just achieving greatness like the legend himself.
俺だとて一度は栄達を夢見た。仕官をして身を固めることが自然な生き方だとも思ったが、しかし俺はまだ修行がしたい。
So this is no doubt just an important film series in Japanese cinema. The first film won an Oscar for Best Foreign Film. It starred Toshiro Mifune, and it was no doubt just a big deal for its time. The films themselves, in my opinion, aren't enough on their own. You still need the source to just be able to fully enjoy the story. The films do look good though. It's well acted, it's well cast, has some very iconic fight scenes. But in my opinion, it's not the best paced. It definitely drags in some aspects. And the love story aspect sort of weigh down the pacing of the film. Especially in the final film, because by then you just wanted it to get on with just the awesome final duel. And the duel at the end at least is worth it. Anyway, this film is widely available. I recommend the Criterion Blu-ray box set. This is at least until we get a better transfer, as it does still look a little dated. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe if you haven't, and if you want to support my channel, I have a Patreon, link is in the description. And like always, thanks for watching.